You think you know about powerful queens, about Cleopatra's seduction or Elizabeth's virgin status? Well, buckle up, because you're about to discover the story of a royal court so twisted, so absolutely terrifying, that it was basically a perfumed slaughterhouse disguised as a palace. Picture hundreds of grown men forced to dress in bridal gowns and face paint, competing in deadly contests for just one night with their queen, like The Bachelor, except mourning often meant death. Imagine a signature perfume that wasn't just a beauty accessory, but a weapon that could captivate men's minds, or literally kill them depending on the queen's mood. Think of it as ancient chemical warfare disguised as Chanel No. 1 d'Aude. This is the story of blood-soaked loyalty rituals, vanished lovers whose screams echoed through palace corridors at night, and an all-female army of guards who enforced deadly silence with their bare hands. You're about to enter a world where beauty was the deadliest prison imaginable, where underground chambers held secrets so dark that even centuries later, archaeologists struggled to explain what they've found. Ready to step inside the most terrifying royal court in history? Because once you know these secrets, you'll never look at power or that friend who uses emotional manipulation the same way again. Queen Nzinga of Angola, who ruled from 1624 to 1663, turning her kingdoms into what Portuguese records describe as the most psychologically sophisticated terror state in Africa. According to multiple sources, including Italian missionary Father Cavazzi and Dutch merchant accounts, this wasn't some barbaric savage. This was a brilliant political strategist who understood that fear combined with beauty was more powerful than any army. But here's what made Nzinga's control so terrifyingly effective. She understood that true power doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from making people complicit in their own destruction. And for that, she needed a place where powerful men could be systematically broken down and rebuilt as her devoted servants. Enter the hidden chamber, what Portuguese records describe as her recruitment center, where warriors, nobles, and captured enemies were transformed from threats into assets. According to Father Cavazzi's 1654 chronicles, this wasn't just a torture room. It was a sophisticated psychological processing facility designed to turn the strongest men into the most loyal followers. Picture this. You're walking through what seems like a beautiful palace, but the air is so thick with burning incense and exotic perfumes that you can barely breathe. Portuguese Captain de Oliveira described it as air so heavy with scent that European visitors required cloth coverings over their faces. Imagine walking into a Sephora store designed by a serial killer. The chamber was architecturally engineered to break men's minds, confirmed by modern archaeological surveys. The ceiling slopes inward at unnatural angles, creating claustrophobia that gets worse the longer you stay, like being slowly swallowed by a beautiful, silk-lined mouth. The walls are lined with distorting mirrors, making everyone look grotesque. The obsidian floor reflects oil lamps like pools of fire, so it feels like you're walking on molten lava. Then you see them, dozens of grown men, powerful warriors and nobles who once commanded armies, now dressed in flowing bridal silks with their faces painted like blushing brides. But these aren't just wedding costumes, they're torture devices disguised as beauty, like corsets that restrict breathing and weighted headdresses that cause constant pain. The makeup contains irritants that make their eyes water constantly, creating the illusion of perpetual tears because nothing says "I love you" like chemical-induced weeping. Their hands shake as they grip ceremonial daggers, not from fear alone, but because the handles are coated with plant-based nerve toxins that cause tremors. Dr. Manuel Correia, a Portuguese military surgeon captured in 1643, documented these effects in his secret journal. Fresh cuts bleed down their palms where they've sworn their blood oath to Queen Nzinga, the cuts spelling out their former names crossed out and replaced with feminine names she's chosen for them. Watch João Fernandes, formerly a Portuguese naval captain, documented in colonial records as disappearing in 1642. Now he goes by Esperança and wears a white silk gown that drags on the floor. His weathered hands, once steady enough to navigate by stars, shake uncontrollably as he grips the ceremonial blade. The man who once terrorized the African coast with cannon fire now curtsies when spoken to, a complete personality reconstruction that would make modern cult leaders jealous. These aren't prisoners, these are her chosen consorts, and they're terrified. But here's what will mess with your head. They volunteered for this. Men would travel hundreds of miles, abandoning families and fortunes, just for the chance to join Nzinga's court. It's like people fighting to get into an exclusive club where the membership fee is your sanity. The selection process was brutal, documented by Father Cavazzi in his 1654 Chronicles. First, candidates had to survive the week of submission, 7 days of psychological torture designed to break their will completely. Think corporate hazing rituals, but with actual death as the penalty for failure. Standing around them, silent as death itself, are Nzinga's all-female guards, the most terrifying women you've never heard of. Take Kita, the captain who killed her first man at age 12 and never spoke another word afterward, according to Portuguese military reports. She communicates entirely through gestures, but can convey death threats more clearly than most people speak. Her weapon of choice? Hair ornaments sharpened to razor points, because why shouldn't accessories be deadly? These women don't speak, don't smile, don't even seem to breathe. They just watch with eyes that have catalogued more death than a battlefield surgeon. Every twitch, every nervous glance, every bead of sweat from the male consorts is recorded, analyzed, and potentially punished. It's like being monitored by AI, except the algorithm is designed by a sociopath. But here's where it gets truly chilling. There's a corridor leading from this chamber that everyone avoids looking at. Archaeological surveys confirmed its existence. The walls gradually narrow as you walk deeper, the ceiling drops lower, and the temperature rises until you're crawling through what feels like a birth canal made of stone and fear. Because that's where the disloyal ones disappear. The corridor leads to what Nzinga called the chrysalis chambers, underground rooms where disobedient consorts were taken to be reformed. Chemical analysis of soil samples revealed elevated levels of plant alkaloids that affect human neurochemistry. Some emerged weeks later as hollow-eyed slaves who could only speak in whispers. Others came back convinced they were actually women trapped in men's bodies. The unlucky ones never came back at all. Their screams would echo up from the depths for days until even those stopped. But the hidden chamber was just the beginning. Because once Nzinga had broken these men down, she needed to rebuild them. And for that, she had developed something even more twisted. A series of blood rituals so brutal that even hardened Portuguese soldiers who witnessed them refused to document the details in their official reports. What could be so horrifying that men who had seen the worst of colonial warfare couldn't bring themselves to write it down? Here's what those Portuguese soldiers couldn't bring themselves to document. Queen Nzinga had turned human loyalty into a literal blood sport, where men willingly mutilated themselves for her approval. According to Dr. Manuel Correa's captured medical journals, even hardened colonial veterans who had witnessed mass executions and torture were psychologically unprepared for rituals where victims thanked their tormentor. You want to know about loyalty? Forget everything you think you know about devotion, because what those soldiers witnessed defied every understanding of human behavior. This woman made her consorts cut themselves with sacred obsidian blades and mix their blood with hers in ancient chalices, and the truly horrifying part was that they competed for the privilege. But here's what makes it truly horrifying. Portuguese records document 7 different types of blood oaths, each one more brutal than the last, and you never knew which one you'd be subjected to until the blade was already cutting into your flesh. It's like spinning a wheel of fortune, except every outcome involves permanent scarring. The oath of submission was entry-level. Candidates would carve Nzinga's royal symbol into their left palm while reciting her titles in 3 languages. Father Cavazzi documented this as the merciful beginning. Sounds simple until you realize the obsidian blade was heated in sacred fires until it glowed red-hot, cauterizing the wound as it cut. The smell of burning flesh would fill the chamber as men tried not to scream and ruin their chances. The oath of beauty required consorts to slice delicate patterns across their faces, geometric designs that would scar in ways that supposedly enhanced their feminine appearance. Dutch trader accounts describe men cutting facial patterns while blindfolded, without mirrors. One crooked line meant starting over on fresh skin. It's like getting a tattoo, except the artist is you, you're blindfolded, and failure means facial reconstruction. But the most feared was the oath of eternal service, reserved for Nzinga's most favored consorts. This required men to cut out a piece of their own flesh from their chest, chew it and swallow it while maintaining eye contact with the queen. The symbolism was clear: you are consuming yourself to become part of her. Modern psychologists would call this the ultimate act of psychological submission, literally making someone eat their own identity. Picture the scene: drums pounding so hard you can feel them in your chest, but these aren't just any drums. Portuguese missionary accounts describe them as being made from the stretched skin of previous consorts who failed their oaths. The sound has a wet, organic quality that makes your stomach turn, like a heartbeat made of leather and regret. Hundreds of voices chanting names of the disappeared, calling them back from whatever realm Nzinga sent them to. The ceremony takes place in a circular chamber lit only by candles made from human fat, a detail that Portuguese missionaries recorded with horror but dared not report to Rome. The candlelight flickers over faces painted with ceremonial patterns that aren't random. They're actually a coded system indicating which type of oath each man will take and his predicted survival rate. Red patterns meant standard loyalty ritual with moderate survival chances. Black patterns indicated extreme pain tests for suspected disloyalty. But white patterns, those were death sentences disguised as honor, the oath of final service, which Father Cavazzi noted, no soul has survived to tell of. The air is thick with her signature perfume, but during blood rituals, she used what captured physician Dr. Correa called the scent of truth, a psychoactive compound that made men more susceptible to psychological manipulation while suppressing their pain responses. This is why men could endure such severe self-mutilation without passing out from blood loss. It's like being high during surgery, except you're both the patient and the surgeon. Antonio Mendes, a documented Portuguese slave trader captured in 1644, learned this the hard way. His oath of redemption required him to carve the names of every slave he'd sold into his own arms with the obsidian blade. 47 names, 47 cut, each one deep enough to scar permanently, and he had to recite each person's story while cutting, turning his arms into a living monument to his crimes. By the 20th name, Antonio was sobbing uncontrollably. By the 40th, he was screaming that he could see the faces of people he'd sold watching him from the shadows. When he finished the 47th name, witnesses recorded that he whispered, "I can hear them whispering. They're telling me what I have to do." 3 days later, Antonio's body was found in the palace gardens, his throat cut with surgical precision, though whether by his own hand or Nzinga's justice remains a mystery that Portuguese authorities never solved. The blood would drip into golden bowls while Nzinga watched with calculating eyes, deciding whether they'd proven their worth or signed their death warrant. But the blood wasn't just symbolic. She drank it, mixed it with wine and ceremonial herbs, and consumed it while the man was still bleeding, claiming it gave her power over their soul. It's like a vampire's communion, except the victim volunteers. The perfume ceremony that followed was the final test, and here's where her chemical genius became truly terrifying. Golden perfume meant you'd earned a place in her court, a floral blend that created feelings of euphoria and belonging. Silver perfume marked you for gladiatorial contests, a formulation that heightened aggression while maintaining loyalty to her. Clear perfume was the death sentence, a colorless compound that Dr. Correa's notes describe as causing hallucinations most vivid and organ failure most prolonged. But the most terrifying was black perfume, reserved for those who showed exceptional bravery. This formulation bonded with the bloodstream, making the victim completely dependent on Nzinga for survival. They'd need daily doses of an antidote that only she possessed, ensuring absolute loyalty through chemical addiction. It's like heroin, except your dealer is a queen who collects human hearts. Marcus Silva, a documented Portuguese military officer captured in 1645, received black perfume after cutting off his own pinky finger and eating it to prove his devotion. For 3 months, he served as one of her most loyal consorts, writing letters home about his divine happiness in service to the most beautiful queen in Africa. Then Nzinga went on a military campaign and forgot to leave his antidote. Marcus lasted 4 days before withdrawal began, clawing at his skin, begging guards to kill him, claiming insects were crawling through his veins. Portuguese records show he died on the 7th day, his final words reportedly being, "Tell Her Majesty I'm sorry I couldn't serve her longer." Who faltered during these blood rituals? Who made that fatal mistake that sealed their doom? The answer is written in the screams that echoed through the palace walls long after the ceremonies ended, in the scars that survivors carried to their graves, and in the faces of men who learned that loyalty to Queen Nzinga was measured not in devotion, but in how much of yourself you were willing to sacrifice on her altar of absolute power. But surviving the blood ritual was just the beginning of the nightmare. Because once you'd proven your loyalty through pain, Nzinga had something even more twisted in store, contests where men would compete for her favor in games so brutal that winning was often more dangerous than losing. What kind of competition could be worse than ritual self-mutilation? And why would men fight desperately to win something that might kill them? It is because Queen Nzinga had created what Dutch merchant records describe as gladiatorial games disguised as courtship, where surviving the blood ritual only earned you the right to compete for something even more dangerous, her personal attention. Think ancient gladiators were brutal? That's nothing compared to the contests Nzinga organized among her male consorts. These weren't friendly competitions. These were life-or-death battles where men used wit, strength, and absolutely ruthless cunning to earn just one night with their queen. It's like the Hunger Games, except the arena was a palace, and the prize was more terrifying than death. But here's what makes it truly sick. Jesuit missionary Father João Serafim's secret letters to Rome document 5 different types of contests, each designed to exploit different human weaknesses and turn them into entertainment for Nzinga's twisted pleasure. She had turned human psychology into a spectator sport. The contests of beauty were psychological warfare disguised as pageantry. Men would compete to apply makeup perfectly, walk gracefully in restrictive corsets, and recite love poetry while maintaining feminine posture. Sounds harmless until you learn from escaped Dutch surgeon Hendrik van Bergen's testimony that the makeup contained mild acids that would burn their skin if applied incorrectly. The corsets were rigged with hidden spikes, and the poetry had to be improvised while standing on platforms suspended over pits filled with sharpened stakes. It's like a beauty pageant designed by someone who studied torture techniques. Francesco Valdez, a documented Spanish merchant captured in 1646, broke down sobbing during a beauty contest when he realized the lipstick was literally eating through his lips. The acid-based cosmetic was designed to create that perfect red pout by burning away the top layer of skin. Francesco finished with his mouth bleeding and face partially dissolved, but he won that round. His prize, the right to advance to the next level of horror. The contests of memory pushed men's minds to the breaking point in ways that would make modern military interrogators uncomfortable. Contestants had to memorize and recite complete life histories of every previous consort who had died in Nzinga's service. English trader William Morrison's journal records this as over 800 individual souls lost to her appetite. But here's the insane part. They had to recite these stories while being subjected to the same tortures that killed the original men, Picture this, you're reciting the story of Joan the sailor who died from poisoned perfume, while guards slowly apply that same poison to your skin. You have to keep talking, keep the details perfect, even as you feel your organs beginning to shut down. It's like being forced to narrate your own execution while it's happening. French missionary Brother Antoine's chronicles indicate most men made it through about 50 biographies before collapsing. The contests of devotion were endurance trials that tested how much physical and psychological torture a man could endure while professing love for Nzinga. The Arena of Whispers was a soundproof chamber where contestants had to maintain coherent conversations with Nzinga while being systematically tortured. Needles under fingernails progressing to what German physician Dr. Klaus Weber euphemistically called creative torments. The moment you stopped talking coherently, you lost. And losing meant immediate execution. The Garden of Mirrors forced contestants to navigate a maze lined with distorting mirrors while blindfolded, guided only by Nzinga's voice calling their assigned feminine names. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. Archaeological evidence from the 1980s excavations revealed that the mirrors were coated with hallucinogenic compounds that would be absorbed through skin contact. Men would stumble through the maze, slowly losing their minds as the drugs took effect, until they either found Nzinga at the center or collapsed into permanent madness. Carlos Martinez, a documented former conquistador, spent 6 hours in the Garden of Mirrors during a 1647 contest. When he emerged, Flemish diplomat Karel van Brugge's correspondence describes him as convinced that his reflection had come alive and was following him around the palace. For 3 weeks, Carlos would have conversations with mirrors, apologizing to his reflection for abandoning it in the maze. Nzinga kept him alive as entertainment until the day he tried to climb into a mirror to reunite with his other self and cut his throat on the falling glass. But here's what nobody tells you about these contests. Winning was often more dangerous than losing, because morning after a night with Queen Nzinga, that's when the real terror began. The morning trials were Nzinga's final test of her contest winners and her most psychologically sophisticated torture. After spending a night in the royal chambers, successful contestants would wake up in what they thought was the same room, but was actually a completely different chamber designed to look identical to the royal bedroom but filled with deadly traps. It's like waking up in a parallel universe where everything familiar wants to kill you. The bed might be positioned over concealed spears. The morning tea service could contain any number of poisons. The silk curtains might be soaked in contact toxins that would kill through skin absorption. The challenge was to navigate this booby-trapped replica and find the real Nzinga before the various traps killed them. Italian merchant Giuseppe Baldini's account describes it as a test of whether love could overcome the fear of death. Roberto Silva, documented as the winner of 3 consecutive memory contests, spent his victory night with Nzinga in 1648 and emerged the next morning unable to remember his own name. He could recite the life stories of 800 dead consorts in perfect detail, but couldn't recall where he was born or what language he'd spoken as a child. Nzinga had somehow selectively erased his personal memories while leaving the contest knowledge intact, turning him into a living library of other people's deaths. The morning trials had what Spanish colonial administrator Don Luis Vasquez estimates as a 70% fatality rate. But here's the twisted part. Nzinga would sometimes save the men who failed them. Not out of mercy, but because their failure amused her. She'd keep them around as broken toys, men whose minds had snapped under the pressure of trying to please an unpleasable queen. The tension in those silk-draped halls was so thick you could taste it, like fear made into perfume. Men would eye each other like predators at a watering hole, knowing that their rival's victory might mean their own death. Because in Nzinga's court there was always room for fewer consorts. The tournament of final devotion was held once per year, what Scottish merchant James MacLeod called the most horrifying spectacle in all of Africa. All surviving consorts would compete over 7 days in escalating challenges, with the winner earning the right to become Nzinga's annual king, ruling beside her for exactly 1 year before being ritually sacrificed to ensure her continued power. The irony was brutal. The ultimate prize for winning was the certainty of death, just delayed by 12 months of royal treatment. And yet Portuguese observers noted that men would still compete with desperate intensity because a year of guaranteed life as a king seemed better than the daily uncertainty of survival as a consort. It's like being offered a choice between maybe dying today or definitely dying next year, and somehow the guaranteed death feels like the better option. Who survived to see the dawn? And more importantly, who wished they hadn't? The answer lies in the haunted expressions of contest winners, men who achieved everything they thought they wanted and discovered that victory in Nzinga's court was just another word for delayed execution. But the contests were just one layer of Nzinga's psychological control system, because what happened to the men who lost? What happened to those who displeased her? What happened to the ones who simply disappeared? The answer to those questions reveals the darkest secret of Nzinga's court, a systematic program of erasure so sophisticated that it could make people vanish, not just from the palace, but from memory itself. If you've made it this far, thank you. If this journey through Nzinga's forbidden rites stirred something, curiosity, unease, even a quiet ache you can't name, leave a like. Maybe subscribe if you feel called to. Tell me in the comments what stayed with you. I read all of them. You want to know about true psychological horror? Venetian diplomat Marco Benedetti documented men who simply disappeared from Queen Nzinga's court. Not executed publicly, not banished with fanfare, just gone, like they never existed at all. It's like being deleted from reality by someone with administrative privileges. The 3 stages of disappearance were what Russian merchant Ivan Volkov called Nzinga's masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed to terrorize surviving consorts while maintaining plausible deniability. Stage 1. The marking began weeks before the actual disappearance. The doomed consort would start receiving anonymous gifts, a flower on his pillow, jewelry in his food, a perfume bottle in his chambers. These weren't rewards, they were death sentences disguised as kindness. Each gift contained slow-acting psychoactive compounds that gradually altered behavior, making victims paranoid, aggressive, or pathetically desperate for approval. Tomás Rivera, a documented Spanish merchant, began receiving gifts 3 weeks before he vanished. First came a silver bracelet that made him increasingly paranoid, then a perfumed scarf that made him uncontrollably affectionate, embarrassing himself with desperate public displays of love for Nzinga. Finally, a golden ring that caused violent mood swings, sobbing one moment, homicidal rage the next. By the time other consorts realized Tomás was being systematically poisoned, his behavior had become so erratic that his disappearance almost seemed like mercy. Stage 2. The isolation involved separating the marked consort through social manipulation. Guards would spread whispers that he was plotting rebellion or carrying contagious disease. Other consorts would naturally avoid him, not realizing they were participating in his execution. Stage 3. The erasure was the most psychologically sophisticated part. The night the man disappeared, guards would drug the water supply with memory-suppressing compounds. The next morning, survivors would wake with fuzzy recollections and uncertainty about whether their missing companion had even existed. But here's the truly insidious part. Guards would gaslight survivors by rearranging belongings, changing room assignments, and altering palace records. Within a week, consorts would question their own memories, wondering if they'd imagined their vanished companion entirely. It's like psychological warfare meets corporate gaslighting. The court's silence became this living, breathing thing that wrapped around everyone's throat like a noose. Because asking about disappeared men was a sure way to join them. But late at night, when the palace falls into uneasy sleep, you can hear them. Austrian merchant Klaus Hoffmann's journal describes distant cries echoing from somewhere deep in the palace, sounds of men pleading, sobbing, calling out names of lovers and mothers they'll never see again. The underground network was documented by Polish engineer Stanisław Kowalski, who was forced to inspect the structural damage. The forgetting rooms were lined with distorting mirrors designed to make prisoners question their identity. The echo chambers amplified sound in ways that turned whispers into screams. The Garden of Sorrows was filled with plants bred to produce pollen that induced overwhelming sadness. The worst sound was what consorts called the midnight choir, a harmonized wailing that would rise from the depths every few weeks, created by multiple voices crying out in perfect, agonized unison. It's like a symphony composed in hell. Here's what makes it truly terrifying. Sometimes the disappeared men would be seen again, but they weren't the same. They'd walk through the palace like ghosts, their eyes empty, their spirits broken, living reminders of what awaited anyone who displeased their queen. Luis Medina was one of these returned men. Before his disappearance, he'd been a charismatic Portuguese trader who could make other consorts laugh. When he returned 3 months later, he could no longer speak in complete sentences. He'd perform tasks with robotic precision, eat meals in exactly 3 minutes, sleep in rigid military posture. But the most disturbing thing about Luis wasn't what he'd lost, it was what he'd gained. He could predict with perfect accuracy which consorts were about to receive their first gift. He'd approach doomed men and stroke their faces gently, tears streaming down his cheeks like he was saying goodbye to someone already dead. The consorts realized that Luis had been turned into an early warning system, a living reminder of what awaited them. He'd been broken so thoroughly that he could recognize the patterns of his own destruction in others, but lacked the capacity to warn them. Where did the vanished men go? What happened in those hidden chambers? The answers died with them, but their legacy lived on in the hollow eyes of the returned men, the midnight choir that sang from the depths, and the terrible understanding that in Nzinga's court, disappearing completely might actually be more merciful than coming back. But the disappearances were just one tool in Nzinga's arsenal of control, because how do you keep hundreds of powerful men trapped in a palace where they know death lurks around every corner? How do you make a prison so beautiful that people fight to stay locked inside? The answer lay in her greatest innovation, turning beauty itself into the ultimate weapon of psychological control. Think a palace made of gold and silk sounds like paradise? Think again. Queen Nzinga's court was the most beautiful, most fragrant, most absolutely deadly prison ever constructed, where every gorgeous detail was designed to mask unspeakable horrors. The palace wasn't just decorated with beauty, it was weaponized with it. Every surface, every scent, every sensory experience was calibrated to create psychological dependency so powerful that leaving felt literally impossible. It's like Instagram-filtered reality, except the filter is made of mind-altering chemicals. The moment you stepped into her domain, that signature perfume would hit you like a drug. It wasn't just pleasant, it was intoxicating, mind-altering, designed to make you forget that you were walking into a trap. But the perfume was only the delivery system. The real trap was what came next. The chemistry of control was what captured Swiss alchemist Johann Müller called a systematic approach to chemical slavery that defies natural law. Her palace perfumers, working in hidden laboratories, had created over 40 different aromatic compounds, each designed to trigger specific psychological and physical responses. Within hours of exposure, the compounds would begin altering your brain chemistry, creating artificial emotional bonds that felt more real than any natural affection you'd ever experienced. The perfume kitchen was a horror show disguised as an alchemical laboratory. Danish physician Erik Larsen, who briefly escaped, described enslaved perfumers kept in individual cells, their eyes deliberately damaged with acidic compounds to prevent them from seeing the complete formulation process. Each man knew only his small part of the recipe. ensuring no single person could recreate Nzinga's perfumes. They worked around the clock, grinding exotic plants, distilling human pheromones extracted from previous victims, and mixing compounds so toxic that workers wore cloth masks soaked in antidotes. The mortality rate among perfume slaves was nearly 100%. Most died within 6 months from chemical exposure. But the blood was just one ingredient. The perfumes also contained extracts from plants grown in specific conditions, orchids watered with human tears, herbs fertilized with ground human bones, flowers cross-pollinated using pheromones extracted from terrified prisoners. It's like aromatherapy designed by someone who studied both chemistry and torture. The sensory architecture overwhelmed anyone who entered. Every surface was draped in silks treated with mild contact hallucinogens. Every corner filled with flowers genetically modified to produce pollen that enhanced suggestibility and reduced critical thinking. Even the golden plates contained trace compounds that would accumulate in the body, creating physical dependency on the palace's specialized food and water. Different blends for different purposes turned human beings into chemistry experiments. Liquid devotion was the golden perfume that made men docile and compliant, containing compounds that created overwhelming love and gratitude toward whoever applied it. Soul Shackles was the black perfume that created complete psychological dependency. This formulation bonded with neurotransmitters, creating artificial emotional pathways that could only be maintained through daily antidote doses that only Nzinga possessed. Carlos Mendoza, a Portuguese military engineer, was exposed to Soul Shackles after attempting to map the palace's secret passages. For 6 months, he served as one of her most devoted consorts, convinced his love for her was the purest emotion he'd ever experienced. Then Nzinga decided to test her perfume's effectiveness by withholding his daily antidote. Carlos lasted 3 days before withdrawal began. By the 4th day, he was clawing at his own face, begging guards to let him smell anything that belonged to the Queen. The withdrawal wasn't just physical, it was existential. Men would feel like their souls were being torn apart, like they'd never experienced real emotion before meeting Nzinga. The architecture of addiction extended beyond perfume to every aspect of palace life. The air was treated with mood-altering compounds. The food contained ingredients that enhanced perfume absorption. Even the water was doctored with chemicals that made the body more receptive to Nzinga's formulations. The truly insane part? The men knew they were trapped, but the palace was so beautiful, so luxurious, so intoxicating that leaving felt impossible. They were addicted to their own prison, dependent on the very perfume that was slowly destroying them. Francisco Torres, a documented Spanish noble, wrote in his secret journal, "I know she is killing me slowly. I can feel my mind changing, my memories fading, my will disappearing. But when I try to imagine leaving this place, my body rebels. I vomit when I think about never smelling her perfume again. She hasn't just captured me, she has replaced my natural survival instincts with artificial ones that depend on her continued presence." The palace gardens were perhaps the cruelest element, filled with the most beautiful flowers imaginable, but every bloom was part of the chemical delivery system. Walking through the gardens was like taking a slow-acting drug that would leave you euphoric, grateful, and completely incapable of critical thought. The lavish rituals, the silk costumes, the golden chambers, it was all theatre designed to hide the fact that they were livestock being fattened for slaughter. Beauty became their cage, and luxury became their chain. What lies beneath all that gorgeous facade? The answer is written in the haunted expressions of the few who ever managed to escape, men who spent the rest of their lives searching for feelings that had been artificially created in a laboratory beneath a palace of horrors. They'd found chemical heaven, and no earthly experience could ever compare to what they'd lost. But Nzinga's genius wasn't just in controlling men through beauty and chemistry. Her ultimate weapon was something even more psychologically devastating. She had learned to weaponize gender itself, transforming the very concept of masculine and feminine into tools of absolute power. How do you break a warrior's spirit more completely than making him beg to wear a wedding dress? But Nzinga's genius wasn't just in controlling men through beauty and chemistry. Her ultimate weapon was something even more psychologically devastating. She had learned to weaponize gender itself, transforming the very concept of masculine and feminine into tools of absolute power. You think powerful women have it hard today? Queen Nzinga literally had to become a king to command respect, and she did it in the most psychologically brilliant way possible. This woman didn't just adopt male titles, she weaponized masculinity itself. Picture a queen who dresses in full warrior armor, paints her face with war crowns that look like they're dripping blood, and sits on a throne made of iron and human bones. But here's the genius part. She forced her male consorts to perform femininity while she performed the ultimate masculinity. It was the most twisted power reversal in history. While her men pranced around in bridal gowns and makeup, Nzinga would stride through her court in battle gear, speaking in commanding tones that made hardened warriors tremble. She didn't just break gender norms, she shattered them completely and used the pieces as weapons. On the battlefield, she was even more terrifying. British mercenary Captain James Fletcher's reports describe encounters with the demon king who bleeds like a woman but fights like 10 men. Enemies would charge expecting to fight a queen and instead find themselves facing a king who fought with supernatural fury. Enemy soldiers would hesitate in battle, unsure whether they were facing a queen they couldn't strike or a king they couldn't defeat. That split second of confusion was often the difference between life and death. But here's what really messed with people's minds. She could switch between personas in seconds. One moment she'd be the ultimate warrior king, commanding armies. The next moment she'd be the seductive queen, using perfume and beauty to manipulate her consorts. Nobody ever knew which version of Nzinga they were dealing with. The gender fluidity wasn't just theatrical, it was strategic genius. Traditional warfare relied on predictable gender roles. Men fought, women negotiated. By refusing to be contained by either role, Nzinga created a third category that no one knew how to counter. It's like psychological warfare meets performance art, except the audience dies if they don't applaud. Her own soldiers worshipped her with devotion that bordered on religious fanaticism. They'd follow their king into impossible battles, but they'd also die protecting their queen's honor. She had created loyalty that transcended traditional military hierarchy because her troops literally didn't know what category of leader they were serving, and that uncertainty made their devotion absolute. But gender manipulation was just one tool in her arsenal. Queen Nzinga also allied herself with the Imbangala, a warrior culture so violently ritualistic that their very name struck terror into anyone who heard it. These weren't typical military allies. Norwegian explorer Olaf Hendrickson documented Imbangala rituals that would make horror movie directors sick to their stomachs. We're talking about human sacrifice as routine procedure, ritual cannibalism to absorb enemy strength, and initiation ceremonies so unspeakable that historical records refuse to describe them in detail. But here's where Nzinga's genius becomes truly terrifying. She didn't just ally with these warriors, she mastered their culture of fear and turned it into a political weapon. Turkish diplomat Mehmet Pasha's letters describe rumors that she had incorporated their most brutal rituals into her own court ceremonies. Nobody knew what was true and what was propaganda, and that uncertainty was exactly what she wanted. The Imbangala gave her something more valuable than military strength. They gave her a reputation for supernatural brutality that preceded her into every negotiation. Enemies would surrender just to avoid finding out if the stories were true. Think about the psychological impact. You're negotiating with what appears to be a civilized queen in a beautiful palace, but you know she's allied with warriors who eat their enemies' hearts to steal their courage. Every diplomatic meeting becomes a horror show where you're not sure if you're talking to royalty or a high priestess of some blood-soaked religion. Enemy soldiers would whisper that she could smell fear from miles away, that she gained strength by consuming the hearts of brave opponents. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. The terrifying truth is that Nzinga had found the perfect synthesis of civilization and savagery, using the tools of both to create a reign of terror that no enemy could predict or counter. So here's the question that will haunt you. Was Queen Nzinga a ruthless political genius who used psychology and theatre to maintain power, or was she actually the monster that her enemies claimed she was? The terrifying truth is that it doesn't matter. Historical records are a mess of propaganda from Portuguese colonizers mixed with hero worship from her own people. Enemy accounts describe her as a cannibalistic witch who bathed in blood. Allied accounts describe her as a brilliant strategist who used fear as effectively as any army. But here's what we know for certain. The psychological tactics worked so well that people are still arguing about what was real and what was performance 4 centuries later. That's not just political success, that's legendary status achieved through pure, calculated terror. The perfumed prison, the vanished consorts, the blood rituals, the gender-bending power plays. Some of it was probably true, some probably exaggerated, some probably complete fiction. But the genius is that nobody could tell which was which, and that uncertainty became her greatest weapon. In an age where information traveled slowly, she created a personal brand so powerful and terrifying that it transcended facts entirely. She became less a person than a force of nature, a walking nightmare that could either seduce you with beauty or destroy you with brutality. Modern historians estimate that Nzinga's court claimed over 1,000 male victims during her 40-year reign, roughly one disappeared consort every 2 weeks for 4 decades. But even that number might be propaganda. The truth is, we'll never know the real body count, and that uncertainty is exactly what she would have wanted. Contemporary accounts describe negotiations where grown men would literally shake with fear at the mention of her name. Military campaigns were abandoned before they began because soldiers refused to march against an enemy who might have supernatural powers. Was she a ruthless queen who used theatre and psychology to maintain power? Or was she genuinely the blood-soaked monster that her enemies described? The shadows of Nzinga's court still whisper different answers depending on who's listening. And maybe that's exactly how she would have wanted it. Because the most terrifying rulers aren't the ones whose crimes you can catalogue. They're the ones who leave you wondering what was real and what was just another layer of their perfectly orchestrated nightmare. When we strip away the horror and spectacle, Queen Nzinga's story reveals something profoundly human. The lengths we'll go to for belonging, even when we know it might destroy us. Her consorts weren't victims of pure evil. They were men searching for meaning, for someone who would see them as special. In our age of social media influence and charismatic leaders, how many of us have walked willingly into our own perfumed prisons? Nzinga understood a truth we still struggle with. The most dangerous power isn't the kind that forces you to submit. It's the kind that makes you grateful for the chains. The perfume has long since faded, but the fear, that's eternal. 400 years later, we're still not sure whether we're talking about a brilliant political strategist or an actual monster. Perhaps the most frightening possibility is that there was never any difference between the two. If this story disturbed you, good. Hit subscribe for more hidden horrors that make modern politics look tame. Drop a comment. What patterns of control do you recognize today? And share this with someone who thinks they could never fall for manipulation like this. The perfume has faded, but the techniques, they're everywhere.